sails on the horizon. Few figures in the tumultuous history of Westeros have risen from such obscurity to such prominence as Christopher of House Mud. Bearing little more than the name of a house long thought extinct, or, to some, mythical, Christopher first emerged at the tourney of Harrenhal, where he stunned the realm by defeating renowned warriors like Lord Jon Royce and the rebel Robert Baratheon in the melee. His triumph did not go unnoticed. Prince Rhaegar Targaryen took an interest in the young warrior, securing him a position within the City Watch of King's Landing. What began as a simple posting soon became the foundation of his legend. Christopher ascended swiftly, rising from sergeant to captain, and eventually to Lord Commander of the City Watch. It was during this period that the storm of Robert's rebellion broke across Westeros. By 283 AC, in his position as commander of the Gold Cloaks, Lord Christopher was no mere observer but a key player in the conflict, his actions shaping the war's course in ways that none could have foreseen. His choices in those fateful days would not only alter his own destiny but change the very fate of the realm itself. Lord Christopher usurped the Lord Paramountcy of the Riverlands in the rebellion's aftermath, a shift as monumental as the rise of the Tyrells over the Gardeners. With House Tully reduced to a boy lord and wedded daughters, protests erupted, most fiercely from Lords Piper and Bracken, who decried the theft of Edmure Tully's birthright. Yet Christopher's allies were formidable. With Lords Blackwood, Went, and Mallister at his back, any thought of open defiance was swiftly smothered. When Christopher rode to Stonehenge and Pink Maiden in 286 AC, it was no mere courtesy visit. A host of hardened Trident veterans and Mud loyalists flanked him, their silent presence more effective than any threat spoken aloud. The protests, so loud in private halls, died like embers in the rain. This grim procession, repeated from Harrenhal to the Twins, became known as the Iron March, a calculated display of strength that cemented the so-called Hands Peace. For 3 years, the Riverlands rebuilt. Lord Christopher's Grand Canal broke ground, and shifts of workers toiled without pause, ensuring that progress never faltered. The Greyjoy rebellion shattered the fragile peace that had settled over the realm. Euron Greyjoy saw opportunity in chaos. He put Seaguard to the torch and sought to do the same to the canal. But there, upon the bloodied banks, Lord Greyjoy's youngest brother would be defeated once and for all. Lord Christopher Mudd stood at the head of a force that would, in the years to come, become known as the Iron Company, a sellsword host forged from former Gold Cloaks who had remained loyal to their iron hand. These hardened men, veterans of the streets and the battlefield alike, would go on to carve their own legend, fighting in the disputed lands and beyond, always awaiting the call of their lord. The rebellion had done more than stir the Ironborn. It had shaken the realm awake from the slumber of the Hands Peace. Though no great battles followed in the immediate years, the simmering tensions beneath the surface began to rise. Old grudges, long nursed in the shadows, came forth once more. Ambitious lords, inspired by Christopher's meteoric ascent, saw their own paths to power. Old enemies, across the narrow sea, had neither forgiven nor forgotten. While Lord Mudd was widely regarded as a necessary evil by the lords of the realm, his monopolistic influence over the young King Aegon did not go unnoticed. The boy, an infant in the dying days of the rebellion, had little memory of his father. Instead, it was the Lord Regent who served as his primary caretaker throughout his childhood, shaping his education, his court, and, some whispered, his very will. Drunken tongues in taverns spun wilder tales, that the Lord Regent and the Queen Mother were more than just political allies, that their closeness veiled something more illicit. Such rumors, absurd as they were, rarely lasted long. Many a loose-lipped troublemaker found himself cooling his heels in a Gold Cloak cell, paying a heavy fine for his treasonous gossip against the Queen Mother. But among the nobility, whispers took a different shape. Dissatisfied lords began shifting their gaze toward Dragonstone, the ancestral seat of House Targaryen, where the old king's widow, Rhaella, had lived since the rebellion's end, accompanied by her 2 remaining children, Prince Viserys and Princess Daenerys. Though no courtier dared speak of it openly, it was noted that those residing on Dragonstone seldom attended royal functions, nor had they ever accepted an invitation from the Lord Regent, whether to a feast, tourney, or hunt. The greatest slight came when Queen Rhaella and Prince Viserys declined to attend King Aegon's name-day tourney, an event of grand spectacle hosted by the Hand himself. Instead, they chose to grace a tourney hosted by Lord Tywin Lannister. That the Lion of Casterly Rock had cultivated such ties with the Targaryens had never been seriously considered before. With that single gesture, the balance of power in the realm subtly shifted. No longer was Lord Mudd viewed as an unassailable force. It was in this period that the factions took shape, and the names they earned would define the decades to come. Queen Rhaella, Viserys, and Daenerys, the last remnants of the old dynasty, came to be known as the Dragons, a name that left no doubt as to its meaning. They were the true Targaryens, the last heirs of Valyria's blood. Meanwhile, King Aegon and Lord Mudd's side would become known as the Crowns. The charitable viewed the name as a nod to Aegon's kingship, a recognition of his rightful rule. Yet the more common, and far more cynical, interpretation was that it referenced the golden crown of House Mudd, a symbol of the true power behind the throne. To their detractors, Aegon was no king in his own right, but merely a puppet of his formidable Lord Regent. The schism within the royal house had begun. The realm was watching, and lines were being drawn between those who had prospered under Lord Mudd's rule and those who had not. Excerpts from The Iron Lord, The Lord on the Throne by Archmaester Peristan. Open the gates. The Lord has returned. The cry rang out from one of Christopher's guards atop the portcullis. A swell of pride filled his chest as he rode through the imposing gates of his ancestral seat. What had once been crumbling ruins just half a decade ago was now a castle worthy of reverence. It was no Harrenhal, but it could stand alongside River Run and any other great fortress in the Riverlands. His forebears had chosen their site well. Perched atop a commanding hill, old stones overlooked the vast expanse of the surrounding lands, ensuring that no large-scale assault could come unnoticed. Its formidable grey granite walls had been raised even higher, narrowing the approaches so that only one feasible point of attack remained. Christopher had also ensured there was an escape route, a concealed tunnel that stretched far from the castle, emerging within an unassuming wine cellar in the castle town below. The cellar belonged to the captain of the town guard, a man fiercely loyal to House Mudd, entrusted with keeping the tunnel's secret. Guards could be stationed near its entrance under the guise of routine duties, arousing no suspicion. A second passage branched away from the first, leading into a secluded glade unknown to all but Christopher himself, a final safeguard. He had taken a lesson from the cruel and left nothing to chance. The builders of the passage had been hand-picked, older men, some well past their prime, lured by generous pay. Some had families whom Christopher later compensated, when their fathers or grandfathers never returned. He had them silenced to the last man. It was not an easy decision, but after long deliberations with Robin, they had agreed it was necessary. And so, it had been done. The reborn old stones now stood proud with 3 grand towers reaching toward the sky. The Tower of the Hammer, the largest and most imposing, held his quarters, his solar, and the chambers of his family. It also housed the maester and the castle's library. At its base, within the heart of the keep, lay the Great Hall, where banners of House Mudd hung once more. The Iron Tower, slightly shorter, stood sentinel over the main gate, offering a commanding view of the approach. It was home to his household guard, their armory, and their captain. Beneath it, in its cellars, lay the dungeons. The Mud Tower, the smallest, served the lifeblood of the castle. It housed the servants' quarters, grain stores, and the workshops of the Fletcher, cobbler, and tailor. In the courtyard beside it, the castle blacksmith toiled at his forge, the clang of hammer on steel a constant song. Unlike its brethren, the Mud Tower was built from pale sandstone, setting it apart from the rest of the fortress. Through one courtyard after another, Christopher and his entourage rode, each set of gates and walls a bulwark against any foolish enough to besiege old stones. At last, they passed the final gate and entered the inner bailey. He was home. Christopher had barely taken the time to change out of his riding gear before setting off in search of his family. Though he had been in River Run, He had given no prior notice of his arrival, so they were likely preoccupied with their own duties. Even Sir Barristan had not remained at his side. Instead, Sir Valtries had taken his place, a reminder that times were changing. The peace of recent years was beginning to unravel. Christopher had passed his 24th name day this year. Though still young, he was no longer dismissed as a mere boy. It had taken years of travel across the kingdom, political maneuvering, and the careful handling of threats, both subtle and overt, to forge the respect he now commanded. Yet, he had come to realize that respect was not always a blessing. To most, he was the true power behind the throne, a regent whose influence eclipsed the crown itself. But it was the others, the ones who saw him as a threat rather than a ruler, that troubled him most. They regarded him as a dangerous adversary, a rival to be watched, or eliminated. Gone were the days when disgruntled lords voiced their grievances openly. Now, they greeted him with warm smiles, a gift in one hand, and a dagger waiting in the other. He had spent much of the political capital earned through his victory in the rebellion. The Dornish, pacified by control over key Marcher castles, now held garrisons in Blackhaven, Nightsong, Harvest Hall, even Stonehelm, on the very edge of the Rainwood. The endless complaints and incidents from that concession had been too many to count, an unrelenting headache. He could only pray for Renly Baratheon to come of age and inherit the mess that had become of his family's ancestral lands. The Stormlands had been the most punished of the rebel kingdoms, partitioned, weakened, and left without a leader of their own. Their young lord was fostered within the Red Keep alongside Aegon and Rhaenys, while their proud nobility remained as wounded dogs, barking and yowling but lacking the teeth or claws to take revenge. Yet, the new generation was rising. The old Robert Royalists were dying off, leaving their lands in the hands of either vengeful heirs or rudderless successors. It was chaos, but controlled chaos. The Stormlands had been taken off the board as a major power. In time, they would rebuild, but Christopher hoped that by then, he would have a loyal Lord Paramount in place, one strong enough to keep them in check, yet not so powerful as to pose a threat to him. The Reach, meanwhile, had emerged from the war as the most powerful kingdom, and they knew it. Their lords bullied their smaller neighbors into lopsided trade agreements, and new border disputes seemed to spring up with every passing moon. Christopher could at least thank the gods that Lord Mace, while ambitious, was too unimaginative to harness his vassals toward a common goal. In some ways, he and Lord Mace shared similar positions, both ruled over realms divided between loyalists and those who would see them cast down. But that was where their similarities ended. Mace feared disrupting the fragile stability holding his vassals in check, lest they turn to open war or outright rebellion. Christopher, on the other hand, had found ways to keep his lords occupied. He offered them grand projects, lofty dreams, and the promise of a new, prosperous Riverlands. Even those who had fought against him in the war sought to participate, not out of loyalty, but to avoid falling behind their neighbors. The canal had become the most striking example of this vision. Thousands of men had labored on it over the years, providing work even for the most worthless village drunk. Engineers oversaw the dredging of shallow parts of the Trident and the construction of locks descending from Old Stones to Iron Man's Bay. What had begun as a regional endeavor had become a kingdom-wide undertaking, drawing workers and merchants from far and wide. Even the Associ had taken notice. Magisters and merchants arrived in Saltpans and Maidenpool, eager to invest in new trade routes, offer financing, or simply supply the workers' camps. Beyond the canal, there was also the arsenal and the newly built Riverguard, a fortress constructed in the first year of the project, deemed essential when the royal fleet stationed in the bay was recalled to deal with yet another pirate incursion in the Stepstones. Now, the arsenal was nearly operational, with the first keels of House Mud's war galleys already laid. Northern timber arrived in steady shipments, traded in exchange for the production of ships bound for the north. Christopher knew the arsenal would have to expand far sooner than planned, but such was the burden of success. If progress continued at its current pace, they were only a few years away from completing the canal, and finally reaping the rewards of their investment. Gods knew it had drained a terrifying amount of coin. The project had already exceeded its projected budget more than once. Every copper star from the Lannister reparations had been funneled directly into paying the canal's workforce. Materials came from across the realm, timber arrived from the Whispering Woods and the north, while stone was hauled from quarries on the Vale's border, supplied by houses like Ruger and Arenford through the Freys. Unfortunately, old Lord Frey had seized the opportunity to bleed the project dry. The taxes he imposed on those shipments were nothing short of extortionate, at times enough to make even Christopher wince. Yet, for all his authority, he had no leverage to put an end to the exploitation. The coffers, both royal and personal, were nearly empty, save for a carefully guarded emergency fund. Meanwhile, debts to the Iron Bank and Lord Tyrell loomed ever larger. And yet, it was enough, just barely. Lord Tyrell and his stewards, working under the Master of Coin, had been forced to do what they did best, scrape together every last tax and tariff they could find to keep the crown solvent. For once, they toiled endlessly, and Christopher received finely detailed reports documenting every coin squeezed from the realm. It was a gamble, a massive one. But the potential rewards were limitless. One did not win if one did not play. Not all of Christopher's efforts had been poured solely into the canal. Mills and workshops powered by the rivers had sprung up around River Run, built wherever the currents allowed, all at his direction. His half-maesters, those who had abandoned the citadel to serve him, had initially dedicated themselves to the canal and the arsenal. But once those projects were designed and set into motion, they found themselves without clear purpose. Christopher had no intention of letting them idle. Instead, he turned their attention to broader advancements across the Riverlands. Chief among these was the challenge of harnessing the power of the rivers that had given the kingdom its name. Waterwheels had long been used for mills, but only in limited fashion. He demanded more. The half-maesters refined and expanded the concept, adapting it for various new purposes. They devised mechanisms of pulleys and gears that allowed the rushing waters to power bellows, providing force and consistency beyond anything human hands could achieve. More curious still were the machines they constructed, ingenious devices capable of spinning yarn and twisting rope with an efficiency no craftsman could match. These half-maesters each had their own fields of expertise and personal interests. Those with a martial focus turned their attention to weaponcraft, seeking to harness the power of water-driven smithies to forge swords, spears, and arms of all kinds. Their goal was nothing less than the creation of a true weapons industry, one capable of supplying not just the Riverlands but exporting arms to foreign markets as well. At first, the Associ merchants had been skeptical. Mass-produced weapons lacked the prestige of castle-forged steel. But once the consistent quality of these new forges was proven, their doubts melted away. While these blades might not rival those crafted by master smiths, they were vastly superior to the crude weapons wielded by common levies. And in war, quantity mattered nearly as much as quality. The Riverlands were not without iron deposits, far from it. The issue was not a lack of resources but rather the absence of developed mines and skilled workers. Centuries of war and setbacks had stunted investment in such industries, leaving the region reliant on imports. Christopher, however, had found a solution. He struck an agreement with several Associ merchants. If they provided the iron and assisted in developing a proper mining industry within the Riverlands, he would, in turn, offer them significant discounts on weapon shipments. The arrangement proved a resounding success. The weapon trade quickly became one of his most significant sources of income. Still, food exports remained the true backbone of Riverland wealth, dwarfing all other revenues combined. Working in quiet tandem with Lord Mace Tyrell, the two great agricultural powers had slowly but steadily raised their prices. It was not long before Lord Lannister took notice. Amusingly, he had even petitioned Christopher in his capacity as Hand, his complaint backed by none other than Lord John Arryn, demanding intervention against what he claimed was blatant market manipulation. Christopher had not even entertained the notion. Instead, he sent a carefully worded response, expressing sympathy for the difficulties of the post-war economy and noting that harvests had been less than ideal. That, of course, was a lie. The Riverlands and the Reach had emerged from the rebellion as the most prosperous of the kingdoms, but there was no need to admit that outright. He would exploit Lord Lannister for all he was worth. The Lion Lord would never be an ally, so why pretend otherwise? Christopher and Sir Valtries had descended from his chambers in the Tower of the Hammer without a single glimpse of his family. "Where do we believe Tristan and Tristan are hiding?" Christopher asked his ever-present shadow. Sir Valtries smirked before answering. "Well, I wouldn't bet against the training yard, that's for sure." "A wise choice, sir," Christopher replied with a nod, and together they set off toward the far side of the castle, where a small courtyard housed the training yard. They walked in companionable silence, moving through the keep's winding corridors, when a voice suddenly called out behind them. "My lord. There you are." Christopher turned to find Sir Edwin Blackwood, his castellan, all but jogging toward them. "Sir Edwin," he greeted with a nod. Though far from unathletic, the Blackwood knight was slightly winded. "I almost didn't believe the guard when he informed me you had arrived. There was no forewarning, the messenger or raven must have gone missing, or—" "There was no message," Christopher interrupted. "It was an impromptu visit." Sir Edwin met his gaze. "I see. And what is the occasion?" Christopher gestured for him to follow. "No occasion per se, just a family visit." The castellan's brow furrowed. "And you were in River Run because?" Christopher glanced at him. "You weren't informed?" "Apparently not," Edwin replied curtly. "I was organizing the Iron Company, as they have decided to name themselves," Christopher explained. "Establishing their command structure, overseeing their training in encampment logistics, and ensuring they are prepared before sailing off to Essos." Sir Edwin's eyebrows rose. "So you're forming a sellsword company after all? I thought you lacked the men." Christopher nodded. "I did. But a fresh group of men has retired from the Gold Cloaks. Sir Lucas Stone leads them, and they will form the core of the company. Of course, we will also recruit further in Essos, along with any who still show interest in serving in the garrisons of Riverguard, River Run, and here. You'll have to speak with Captain Brian about that," Sir Edwin replied, half jesting. "He only gives me the figures for expenses and informs me when they're running larger drills, not a shred more. Quite possessive of his guard, I must say." "Well, considering how much he complains about the new recruits, it's his pride and joy," Christopher remarked with a sly smile. "He's still unmarried, isn't he?" "Married to the guard," Sir Edwin quipped. They shared a light chuckle before Christopher continued on. "I'm sure you have some matters for me?" Christopher asked as he followed the castellan. Sir Edwin gave a quick nod. "I do, my lord." "Then I'll take care of them tomorrow, if there's nothing truly urgent," Christopher replied, though he already knew the answer. Sir Edwin's expression darkened in mock seriousness. "Very well, my lord. But don't doubt for a second that I'll drag you out of bed if I must." Christopher smirked, but there was a glint of understanding in his eyes. "I wouldn't put it past you, sir." They part ways as Christopher finally arrives at the training courtyard. As he and Sir Valtries walk out onto the covered walkway overlooking the grounds, they are immediately met with the rhythmic clash of swords, the sharp, metallic sound filling the air. Down within the fenced yard, Christopher immediately recognized the two boys clashing swords, their faces etched with determination, eyes alight with youthful competitiveness. To the side stood a younger man clad in a grey surcoat, a running direwolf emblazoned across his chest. Old Stone's new master-at-arms, Sir Benjen Stark. Christopher had knighted him after he'd led the defense against a band of marauding bandits along the new road connecting Old Stones and River Run. Since then, Sir Benjen had taken to teaching swordsmanship as though born for it, despite his youth. Christopher cared little for the man's age when considering the Stark's natural affinity for both the sword and teaching. "Watch your footwork, Tristan." Sir Benjen called to Christopher's oldest son, now 8 name days old, considerably bigger than his younger half-brother. But still, not old enough to resist Sir Benjen's tricks Christopher himself had taught the Stark a few years ago. As Tristan focused on his footwork, which Christopher could see from the walkway was surprisingly solid, his opponent struck. Tristan charged forward, taking advantage of his brother's momentary lapse in attention. The younger boy, still just 5 name days, feinted a strike with his blade before spinning into a quick kick that struck Tristan's padded thigh and sent him tumbling. "I did it. Sir Benjen, I did it." Tristan cheered, dancing around in triumph. Christopher could see the slight frustration in Tristan's eyes, the older boy holding back from retaliating against his victorious younger sibling. "A fine trick," Christopher called out, his voice carrying over the yard. But Tristan was not far from recovering. "A fine showing from both of you." All 3 turned their heads toward the walkway, spotting Christopher and Sir Valtries standing above them. "Papa," Tristan exclaimed excitedly. "My lord," Sir Benjen greeted, nodding his head in respect. "I was teaching the boys the unfairness of battle." Christopher tilted his head, a glimmer of amusement in his eyes. "As is your right. My sons will not be defeated by simple tricks and will learn the true nature of a fight." He began walking toward the nearest staircase, descending into the courtyard. "I can't help but recognize elements of my own lessons with you and Edmure, though I would have thought that came when you were older," Christopher said with a raised brow, a challenge in his tone. "Surely it was a little early to teach them this yet?" The younger man cleared his throat. "I thought it wise to start early with them, they're both showing great promise with the sword." Christopher raised a hand in acknowledgement. "It is your choice, Benjen, and I have total confidence that you'll teach them well. Just don't be too eager. You have to maintain a balance, yes?" "Of course, my lord," Benjen replied. Christopher didn't intend to admonish him, but he wanted to ensure that Benjen understood the importance of measured progress, of not pushing too far too fast, and that he could justify his choices, even to himself. "Good," Christopher said warmly before turning his attention to his sons. He barely caught Tristan before the boy leapt into his arms. "Hello to you too, Tristan," Christopher said with a chuckle. "Did you see that?" the boy asked eagerly, his voice filled with excitement. "It's the first time I've beaten Tristan. He's always too strong and fast for me." "It was very impressive," Christopher replied, giving the boy an encouraging smile. "Especially the feint with the sword." Tristan's face softened slightly as he spoke quieter, almost shy. "Sir Benjen showed me how to do it yesterday. Very good." Christopher's tone was warm, pleased. "Now, will you go change? I'm thinking of an earlier feast today, and I'd rather not have your mother complain that you smell of training again. Is that clear?" Tristan met his gaze with a solemn nod. "All right, Papa. Will you stay long?" Christopher hesitated for a moment, looking thoughtfully at his son. "We shall see. You know my duties can spring up at any time, but I'll try to remain as long as I can." The boy hugged him one last time before Christopher gently lowered him back to the ground. "Benjen, take him to his chambers and make sure he's changed into his fine clothes. I'm sure a maid can assist you with drawing a bath and picking the proper outfit." "Come along, Tristan," Benjen said, nodding at Christopher's instructions. Christopher watched as the two disappeared into the keep before turning his attention to his other son. Tristan stood, looking both pleased and a little embarrassed. He shifted his feet awkwardly, his gaze fixed on the ground, avoiding his father's eyes. "Son, there's no shame in it," Christopher said, his tone calm and reassuring. "Today you were outwitted, but tomorrow, you'll learn, yes?" When Tristan didn't respond, Christopher grew a little more direct. "I saw your footwork, Tristan. It was excellent. You should have seen the clumsy, shaky recruits I had to deal with in the early days of the Gold Cloaks. You'd have thought they were new to their legs." Christopher caught a flicker of a smile tugging at the corner of Tristan's mouth. "You just need to trust in yourself," Christopher continued, his voice firm but reassuring. "Know you're in a strong stance, and keep a steady hand on your weapon." With that, Christopher took a step forward and, with lightning speed, reached out and tickled his son. Before Tristan could protest, Christopher scooped him up into his arms. and never take your eyes off your opponent," he added finally, his voice warm and full of amusement. The sound of Tristan's giggles and delighted shrieks filled the air, and Christopher's heart swelled with joy. "Did you understand?" Christopher asked, his tone light as he gave Tristan another gentle tickle. "Yes, yes. Just stop tickling," Tristan gasped between his laughter. "Good," Christopher said with a smile, finally relenting. "I can already see you'll make a fine swordsman if you put in the effort." Tristan beamed at the praise, though his curiosity sparked again as Christopher continued. "And if it helps, know that Benjen was once tricked in the exact same way. I taught Ed Muir that same feint, the one Tristan used on you. And I'll have you know, Benjen ended up flat on his back, just like that." Tristan hesitated, a hint of disbelief in his eyes. "Really? Oh yes," Christopher chuckled, leaning in a little. "Benjen complained for days about how unfair it was. Said I'd taken sides, all that. But the next time we sparred, he used it on me, and beat me fair and square. Not every lesson's fun, but they're all necessary." He let the words linger in the air, allowing Tristan a moment to reflect on the lesson of resilience and growth before shifting the conversation. "So," Christopher asked, glancing around the yard, "where are the rest of your siblings?" The latest pregnancy had resulted in twins, Adam and Manisa, named in honor of both Sarah's aunt and Christopher's foster brother. The Maester had warned that further pregnancies could be risky for Sarah's health, a precaution Christopher couldn't help but heed. 4 healthy children, all thriving, were a blessing, and now, their focus was on nurturing and raising them as best as they could. Tristan's expression faltered slightly at the mention of his younger siblings, and Christopher's concern deepened. "What is it?" he asked gently. "Nothing," Tristan replied after a moment, though his hesitation was clear. "They're with Lady Mudd and Maester Allard for their lessons." "Ah," Christopher said simply. "Well, I want you ready for the feast as well. Run along and get changed." "All right," Tristan replied quietly, as he hugged him a last time before Christopher lowered him to the ground. Christopher sighed deeply before speaking, his voice softer now. "You know I love you just as much as your other siblings, don't you?" Tristan, who had stopped in his tracks, turned around slowly. His young face was troubled, uncertainty clouding his eyes. After a moment, he gave a trembling nod, "Yeah." Christopher closed the distance between them, his heart heavy with the knowledge that his son's unrest stemmed from his own mistake. He placed a firm yet gentle hand on Tristan's shoulder. "You are my firstborn son," he said, his tone steady, "but, God's willing, you will never inherit Old Stones or River Run. As crude as it sounds, that is simply the truth. But know this, you will never be cast aside, never be hidden away." Tristan hesitated before nodding weakly. "You have a freedom your trueborn siblings never will," Christopher continued. At that, Tristan's head snapped up, his lips parting as if to protest. Christopher raised a hand to stop him. "Look at Adam, my old friend. Do you remember him? Even if only a little?" "Yes," Tristan answered cautiously. "He was Adam Waters, the bastard son of Sir Roger Hogg. But then, alongside me, he became Sir Adam. Then we became sergeants, then lieutenants, then captains. He followed me as commander of the City Watch, and later, he served as my first master of laws." Tristan listened intently, his expression conflicted. "You will face hardship, I won't deny that. And it is my greatest shame that it must be that way for you. Not because of your birth, but because of circumstance." Christopher spoke firmly, making sure his son understood. "But you also have opportunities, endless opportunities, if you set your mind to them. Tristan cannot abandon his duties. Celia and Manisa will marry for political alliances. Little Adam will inherit River Run in time. Their paths are laid before them, for better or worse. But you? You can carve your own." He paused, watching his son carefully. "In time, I have no doubt you will earn your knighthood. Or," he added, a small smirk tugging at his lips, "you could pursue knowledge instead. Don't think I haven't noticed your late-night visits to the library." A hint of colour rose to Tristan's cheeks, and despite himself, he cracked a small smile. "I will assist you as much as you need or want, my son. The world lies before you, ready to be conquered in time," Christopher declared. Then, with a playful smirk, he added, "But first, you need a bath and a fresh shift. I've met badgers that smell better." Tristan gave a silent nod, but in their shared eyes, Christopher saw that at least some of his words had struck home. Without another word, the boy turned and ran off into the keep. Christopher watched him go, following his movement until he disappeared into the corridors. Then, he let out a slow breath and tilted his head up to the evening sky. The setting sun cast a golden light across the clouds, painting them in hues of amber and crimson. "A beautiful sight. A moving speech, my lord," Sir Valtries remarked. "I know my natural-born brother would have liked it very much if our father had told him something similar." Christopher turned to him, mildly surprised. The King's Guard were not prone to sharing personal matters. "I wasn't aware Lord Sunglass had a natural-born son." Sir Valtries' expression grew somber, regret creeping into his features. "Well, he hid him away in a village near Sweetport Sound. I only learned of him when I was older. His name was Godry. My older brother, Guncer, never much liked him. But I was at least sympathetic." Christopher considered that. "Lord Guncer is quite pious, is he not?" Sir Valtries seemed taken aback by the observation but nodded. Yes, my lord." Christopher let the thought linger for a moment before bringing them back to the matter at hand. "And what became of Godry? Where is he now?" The King's Guard swallowed before answering. "When the war broke out, he was eager to prove himself. It was one of the only times we ever spoke, when he left with my father to fight under his command." Valtries paused, his jaw tightening. He had never even held a sword before, being the son of a cobbler's daughter. "He died at the Battle of the Bells. I didn't even learn of it from my father," another soldier told me after the war had ended. Christopher had suspected this story would have no happy ending. "I'm sorry to hear that, sir." Sir Valtries shrugged, though his face betrayed his regret. "I never truly knew him." There was a beat of silence before he looked at Christopher. "You're doing a fine thing with Tristan, my lord." "I try," was Christopher's only reply. The rich aromas of roasted meats, spiced wine, and freshly baked bread filled Christopher's nose as he stepped into the great hall. Beside him, Sarah clutched his arm tightly, as if determined not to let him slip away again. As beautiful as ever, or, in his eyes, only growing more radiant with the years, Sarah was adorned in a plum-colored gown befitting the wife of a lord paramount. The rich fabric complemented her elegance, a quiet yet undeniable reminder of her station, even if the guests gathered at Old Stones tonight were not the most prestigious. Among them was a Frey knight, here to petition something or other on behalf of his father, grandfather, or whatever distant relation bound him to Lord Walder. Christopher had lost track of the ever-multiplying branches of that family tree, and he doubted this particular Frey's request would be of much consequence. More familiar faces rounded out the gathering. Lord Lucius Vipron and Sir Harmon Page of Fairmarket had become near-permanent fixtures at Old Stones, each eager to cultivate favour as neighbours holding lands on opposite banks of the Blue Fork. Sir Harmon, at least, was a man of honesty, an anomaly among the nobility and a rare sort of ally. As the Knight of Fairmarket, he had proven himself capable, and Christopher found his company agreeable. Lord Lucius, on the other hand, was less pleasant. With his Frey wife and an eye always turned toward political maneuvering, he was ever the opportunist. Still, he was not without his merits. He could be entertaining at times, particularly on a hunt, and for all his scheming, he had yet to cross any true lines. In comparison to King's Landing, it was amateurish and amusing to Christopher in its own way. Perhaps it could prove a fine opportunity for some learning when Tristan was ready to try ruling. Something to consider. Christopher and Sarah had shared a precious half-hour together in his chambers upon his return, a moment of warmth before duty called them to prepare for the evening's feast. She had been elated to see him, though that had not spared him from a firm admonishment for failing to send word of his arrival. Their daughter Celia, now 4 name days old, had shrieked with delight upon spotting him and flung herself into his arms, following the example set by her brothers. He had barely managed to stay on his feet before Adam and Manisa, the twins, wrapped themselves around his legs, squealing with joy. At 3 name days, his youngest children had grown considerably in his absence, seemingly doubling in height since he last held them. Yet what truly filled him with gratitude was that they still recognized him. There had been times when his other children were younger that they had not, and the memory of those moments had been nothing short of heartbreaking. At times like these, Christopher found himself wondering if he should cast aside the burdens of the handship, the regency, and the ceaseless web of politics, to simply remain here, with them. But he could not falter. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every decision made was for their future. If he were to fall now, he feared House Mudd would not hold for long. His son Tristan, young and full of promise though he was, would not yet be ready to bear the weight of rulership, even with the competent men Christopher had placed around him. King's Landing was a nest of vipers, where positions of power were granted through political maneuvering rather than merit. The Red Keep swarmed with schemers, each vying for influence. But Christopher had refused to let old stones become the same. Every man and woman under his command had been carefully chosen, vetted extensively, and placed with purpose. River Run, with its deep-rooted traditions, had become a mix of both ideals, pragmatism and loyalty. Riverguard, the last holding in practice under his command, was for now a purely military holding. Christopher and Sarah took their seats at the center of the high table, their children settling in beside them. Before him, a feast had already been laid out, and after moons away, he was eager to partake. Once the room quieted, Christopher rose, offering a charming smile to his guests. "It is my pleasure to be home once more, surrounded by my family and fine company," he began smoothly. Lord Lucius and Sir Harmon, well accustomed to these formalities, nodded politely. The Frey Knight, however, looked absolutely ecstatic. The young man was not the eldest of his brood, nor the most fortunate in appearance. His face bore the telltale pockmarks of childhood illness. He also had the air of someone entirely unaccustomed to travel, let alone the etiquette of a lord's table. Christopher wondered if he had ever left the twins before. "Thank you, Lord Mudd," the knight blurted out, his voice too loud, too eager. A silence followed. The servants, who had been moving about the hall, paused mid-step. A few exchanged hushed whispers while casting sidelong glances at the young Frey. Realization dawned on the knight's face, his expression shifting from triumph to mortification as he grasped his blunder. At least he had the sense to recognize it, which was more than could be said for many of his kin. "You are welcome, sir?" Christopher prompted, his tone measured. The man stiffened. "Walton Frey, my lord," he introduced himself shakily, gripping something, a letter, in his trembling hands. That, at least, explained his nerves. "I am here at the behest of my grandfather, Lord Walder Frey of the Twins and the Crossing," Walton continued, the words tumbling out in a rush. Christopher suppressed a sigh. That hardly narrowed it down. Across the table, Sir Harmon exhaled sharply, shaking his head in disbelief. Lord Lucius, meanwhile, looked both embarrassed by his Frey connections and terribly amused, half concealing a smirk behind his fist. "I see," Christopher said at last, glancing pointedly at the rolled parchment still clutched in Walton's grip. "I am sure we will have time to discuss Lord Walder's concerns later this evening." As Christopher settled back into his chair, ready to enjoy his long-awaited feast, he felt his wife lean in close. Sarah's expression remained pleasantly composed, but the sharp glint in her eyes betrayed her disapproval. "You would think they were raised in a pigsty, judging by their manners," she murmured, her voice just low enough to be heard over the clatter of plates and chatter of the hall. Christopher smirked as he carved into the venison before him. "I think you do pigsties a disservice with that comparison," he quipped. Sarah let out a small, reluctant laugh, shaking her head as she reached for her own goblet. The food before them was a reminder of the privileges afforded to the nobility. The venison was tender, seasoned with a blend of imported spices. Freshly baked bread, still warm from the ovens, sat beside golden slabs of butter. Fruits and cheeses from all across the riverlands filled the table. For all the burdens that came with lordship, a meal like this was one of its undeniable rewards. The common small folk rarely, if ever, experienced such variety or richness. Even the lower nobility, the landed knights and lesser lords, often dined on simpler fare. Perhaps that was why Lord Lucius and Sir Harman lingered so often in his halls. The comforts of old stones were undoubtedly finer than what awaited them at Vyprin's Stilfen or Fairmarket. He took another bite, letting the flavors settle on his tongue before glancing across the table at his guests. Perhaps that was why they stayed for so long? "How long can you stay this time?" Sarah asked, her voice measured but laced with quiet longing. Christopher sighed. "At most 3 days." Sarah sighed, swirling the wine in her goblet as she studied him. 3 days, she repeated, the disappointment barely hidden beneath her composed expression. "You've been gone for moons, Christopher." "I know," he admitted, his tone softer now. "But you also know how it goes." Her fingers drummed lightly against the table. "Yes. I do." Christopher reached over and gave her hand a brief squeeze. "I focus on you and the children now, I swear it. No court politics, no council matters, just my family." "Except for Sir Frey," she murmured, lifting a brow. Christopher let out a quiet chuckle. "Someone has to end his misery. But otherwise, yes." Sarah shook her head, though a small, reluctant smile played at her lips. "Poor man. He'll be lucky if he survives the night without choking on his own nerves." Christopher glanced down the table where Sir Walton Frey sat stiffly, barely touching his meal, his eyes flickering anxiously between his goblet and his surroundings. Christopher almost felt sorry for the man. Almost. "Perhaps we should send him extra wine," Christopher mused. "A few cups might loosen his tongue enough to get to the point of his visit before morning." Sarah smirked, taking a sip from her goblet. "Or loosen his knees enough to tumble right under the table. Either way, it would be entertaining." "Then consider it a gift to our guests," Christopher said with mock solemnity before finally turning his attention back to his meal. The feast carried on smoothly, with laughter and conversation filling the hall, but Christopher found his patience wearing thin as the evening progressed. His children had long since departed from the table to play, and he had made sure 2 guards followed them, a precautionary measure for the safety of his youngest. It wasn't long before he turned his attention back to Sir Walton, who still seemed like a nervous wreck sitting across from him. "Sir Walton," Christopher began, his voice steady, "I trust the food was to your liking?" The Frey knight visibly jumped at the sudden address, his startled reaction almost comical. Christopher's reflexes twitched, his hand almost reaching for Torrent, but he quickly calmed himself. When had he become so jumpy? Yes, my lord," Sir Walton stammered, his voice far too loud in the otherwise quiet room. Christopher couldn't help but notice the untouched plate before the man, though the wine goblet was completely empty. "You had a letter, yes?" Christopher prompted, his gaze steady. Sir Walton seemed to snap back to attention, fumbling for the letter. "Indeed, my lord, here it is," he said, handing over the crumpled parchment. Christopher took the letter from him, smoothing it out carefully. It bore the sigil of House Frey, a reminder of the fool he was about to deal with. As he read, his jaw tightened. The arrogance of Walder Frey never ceased to amaze him. The old lord thought he could manipulate Christopher into marrying off his eldest daughter, Celia, in exchange for a cut in the quarry taxes. Not even a full removal of the levy, just a meager reduction. The audacity was staggering. His eyes moved further down the letter. The suggestion that Christopher's son, Tristan, be sent to the twins as a ward in exchange for Ryman Frey? The son of Sir Stephen Frey, meaning the second in line to the twins. Celia married to a Hostine Frey. The thought alone made Christopher's blood boil. The anger surged within him, burning hotter than the wine, hotter than anything he'd felt in years. The thought that Walder Frey had the audacity to treat him like a fool, like someone who could be easily manipulated or swayed by petty offers, struck a nerve that Christopher hadn't even known existed. He could feel the temperature rising in his chest, and as his eyes flicked toward Sir Walton, he saw the nervous knight instinctively lean back, eyes wide, as if he could sense the storm gathering. Sara, ever the calming presence at his side, placed a steadying hand on his arm, and the simple touch helped ground him, if only for a moment. She silently reached for the letter, and Christopher passed it to her without a word. As she read it, he slowly regained control, the fury beginning to twist into a cold, biting resolve deep in his gut. He had allowed himself to be patient, to try and keep his emotions in check for the sake of diplomacy, but enough was enough. He turned his gaze back to Sir Walton, the Frey knight who had become little more than a messenger for Walder's arrogance. "You can tell Lord Walder," Christopher began, his voice low but full of icy venom, "that if he ever dares to insult me with such an offer again, I swear upon the gods themselves, I will tear the twins down stone by stone and salt the earth beneath them. He can apologize by ceasing his borderline treasonous taxes that he's been levying upon his liege lord." There was no room for negotiation, no room for a civil discussion. The words came out with a sharpness that cut through the tense air like a blade. "Now, get out of my sight," he finished, his voice seething. The Frey knight didn't need another invitation. He scrambled to his feet, fumbling in his haste, and bolted for the door with all the speed his legs could carry him. In his panic, he crashed into the doorframe, a loud crash reverberating through the hall as he stumbled out of sight, leaving behind a stunned silence. Christopher blinked once, then twice, realizing that perhaps he hadn't quite regained his composure as he had believed. He let out a slow breath, shaking his head, the anger now settled but replaced by the weight of the situation. Christopher glanced up just in time to see Sara's hands trembling with fury, her expression twisted with disgust. "How dare the old coot?" she spat, throwing the crumpled letter down onto the table with a force that made the parchment flutter. "You should have taken his head right then and there." He could see the fury in her eyes, and he understood it. This time it was he who placed a steadying hand on her arm, his voice a calming counterpoint to her rage. Now, my love. Walder Frey is a vile old lecher. He won't hang on much longer, I'm sure of it." Sara's sharp laugh had a bitter edge to it. "Joy," she muttered dryly, her words laced with an unspoken fear for what might come next. Christopher's lips curled into a faint smile as he tried to lighten the mood, though he couldn't entirely rid himself of the tension that still clung to the air. "Perhaps I'll declare war on the North and let them handle the Freys. Would that be agreeable, dear wife?" His words were meant to be playful, but his mind was already formulating. But Sara's gaze remained steely, her expression unamused. "Do not treat it lightly," she warned, her voice low and firm. "Walder Frey certainly takes himself seriously, and his arrogance is ever prickly. His memory is long, and his reach may be farther than you think." Christopher nodded gravely. "Do not mistake my jest for dismissal," he said, his tone measured. "Walder Frey is my vassal, and this insult, is nothing more than calculated posturing. A fabrication of slights, meant to needle me into anger." He exhaled sharply, forcing himself to unclench his fists. "Which, I suppose, he succeeded in this time." Sara shook her head, a smirk tugging at her lips. "Let's not allow that old bastard to spoil the rest of our night. We've been apart for too long as it is." Christopher met her gaze, the weight of their responsibilities momentarily forgotten. "Shall we retire to our chambers, then?" She feigned deep thought, glancing theatrically around the hall. I suppose I'll need a handsome lord to escort me. Though, where to find one?" She tapped her chin in mock contemplation. "Lord Lucius is looking rather dashing." Christopher scoffed, folding his arms and looking away as if wounded. "Have you seen his sigil? If Lady Toad is truly your dream, I won't stand in your way." "You make a fair point," she conceded with a teasing glint in her eye. "But I'm not sure one named after sediment is much better." "Says the Bat Lady," Christopher shot back, raising a brow. Don't pretend you stand on higher ground here. Sarah let out a playful huff. Just escort me to our room already, before I change my mind. Christopher extended his arm, smirking. Oh? Do I suddenly meet all your lofty requirements after all? She rolled her eyes, slipping her arm through his. You just want me to call you handsome. A handsome lord, he corrected with a grin, leading her toward the door. Another ale. I am the fucking heir to these rocks. Roderick Greyjoy bellowed, slamming his fist onto the bar with enough force to rattle the empty tankards. His breath reeked of salt and strong drink, and his wild eyes fixed on the barkeep with drunken intensity. If you were on my crew, I'd have you keelhauled for making me wait. He jabbed a wavering finger at the man, his movements as unsteady as the tide. The barkeep, an old salt with a face like driftwood, barely flinched. He held the ale just out of Roderick's reach, his lips curling in disdain. I'll have you know, I sailed with Dagon, the last true reaver, you little shit. We can only thank the drowned god that Killion kicked the bucket. Fuck you, Roderick slurred, throwing his arm back to strike, only for his balance to betray him. The stool teetered, then toppled, sending him crashing to the floor with a loud thud. A moment of stunned silence. Then the barkeep dumped the ale over his face. Enjoy. He barked, grinning as Roderick sputtered and swore, coughing up equal parts liquor and fury. A voice, thick with sarcasm, rang out from the entrance. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the heir to the Seastone chair. Roderick wiped the ale from his eyes and squinted through his drunken haze. The blurred figure standing in the doorway wore a quartered surcoat, one he knew well. Cousin, he bellowed from the floor. The figure strode forward, boots thudding against the planks. Then the unmistakable sound of steel being drawn. Roderick barely had time to react before the cold kiss of a blade met his throat. Even drunk, some instincts remained, and he slid back on his elbows, suddenly very aware of his own mortality. So you aren't completely bereft of your faculties, the man mused. Roderick's vision finally focused. Standing over him was Harris Harlaw, nightfall in hand, its Valyrian steel gleaming even in the dim light of the tavern. Why the fuck would you do that, Harris? Roderick spat, voice thick with outrage. Harris smirked. It's Sir Harris now, he corrected. Roderick let out a sharp bark of laughter. Are you a fucking Greenlander now? Harris sneered and spat onto the floor between them. Say that again, and I'll drown you myself, Greyjoy or not. Roderick scowled. Then why in the hells would you take a knighthood? Harris shrugged. It was not a thing to refuse. And besides, it sounds impressive, does it not? Roderick snorted. For all the maidens, maybe. He raised his voice to a high, mocking pitch. Oh, Sir Harris, save me. Harris smirked. See? You understand. Roderick groaned and flopped back onto the floor. Shut your mouth and help me up. Roderick let out a grunt as a boot connected with his ribs. Help yourself, you drunkard, Harris muttered, settling into a nearby chair. He rapped his knuckles on the table. 4 of the good stuff. The bartender barely spared him a glance, his expression twisted with disdain. I don't serve Greenlanders. Harris stilled, his fingers idly tracing the hilt of nightfall. The Valyrian steel caught the dim light, glinting ominously. Did you not hear the rest of what I said, fucker? The bartender snorted, unimpressed. Go home to your green lands. That was the last straw. From his position on the floor, Roderick had an interesting vantage point as Harris shot up from his chair. In 2 swift strides, he vaulted over Roderick's prone body and cleared the bar, crashing into the bartender. There was a sharp scuffle, grunting, a chair scraping against wood, the unmistakable rasp of steel being drawn. Then, a gasp. The kind that came only once. Roderick's stomach twisted as he forced himself upright, his pulse pounding in his ears. He braced a hand on the bar and peered over the edge. Harris kneeled above the bartender's crumpled form, his surcoat splattered with red. The body at his feet gave a weak shudder before stilling completely. Harris wiped his blade clean on the dead man's tunic and exhaled. "Suppose I'll have to pour our drinks now." Roderick groaned and let himself slump back onto the floor. "Fuck me. Father is going to be furious." Harris rose from behind the bar, unfazed, and prepared 4 glasses. "Perhaps," he said with a casual shrug. "But I hear from our other cousin Roderick that he may have other matters keeping his attention." Greyjoy clumsily pulled himself onto the nearest stool, his movements sluggish and uncoordinated. He swayed for a moment, struggling to keep his head upright. "Oh? And what are those?" he slurred, blinking rapidly in an effort to focus. Falling back onto the floor earlier had not been his smartest decision. Harris, now fully embracing his role as bartender, grabbed a pitcher of black tar rum, not some watered-down, spiced drink from the Greenlands. He poured generously, filling each cup to the brim with the dark, potent liquid. Without a word, he lifted his glass first. "To family, eh?" Roderick reached for his own, nearly knocking it off the bar before his fingers tightened around it. He swayed, steadied himself, then raised it shakily to match. Fuck," he muttered before throwing the drink back. "They're planning to reeve the entire west coast," Harris said casually, swirling the rum in his cup. "From Barrowton to the Shield Islands." Roderick barely had time to react before he choked, hacking violently as he struggled to swallow. Tell me you're lying." "By the drowned god, cousin," Harris vowed, his expression dead serious. Roderick blinked, stunned for a moment, before a slow grin spread across his face. "Fucking finally. But how in the name of the drowned god does Uncle Roderick know before me?" "Well, maybe because he answered the Greyjoy's summons this morning," Harris said with a broad grin. "Instead of trying to outdrink the entire fucking port last night." Roderick's eyes widened in shock. "Uncle Roderick is on pike?" "All the Lord Captains are," Harris confirmed. "Drum, Blacktide, Botley, Goodbrother, Kenning, Stonetree, Saltcliffe, and a whole lot more bastards. Most arrived late last night or early today, by your father's command." He smirked and lifted his second glass. "Which, incidentally, is why I'm here. Don't you try to trick me with the second glass," Roderick warned, lifting it high, too high, sloshing rum over the counter. Harris smirked. "Why would I do such a thing?" "Already did, you bastard," Roderick muttered, but he clinked his cup against his cousin's all the same. "To the iron price, salt wives, and screaming Greenlanders," Harris toasted. Roderick let out a bark of laughter, and together they threw back the second round, the burn of the rum settling deep in their guts. Roderick scowled as he leaned against the mast, arms crossed, his mood as dark as the nearly moonless sky. Only the steady rhythm of the oars striking the water kept him from cursing aloud. This was his ship, the Kraken's Kiss, one of the fastest in the Iron Fleet, a vessel he took great pride in. So how dare his uncle Euron seize command of it? It wasn't for any tactical reason. No, it was just Euron lording his rank over him, flexing his authority while they were beyond his father's watchful gaze. Roderick could practically hear the smug amusement in his uncle's voice whenever he barked an order. Their mission, given by his father after the King's Moot crowned him Balon 9, was to attack and destroy an arsenal in the Riverlands. Roderick had barely believed it when he first heard. An arsenal? Here? He had only ever heard of the one in Braavos, and now there was one in Iron Man's Bay of all places. And a canal as well? "What the fuck is that Mud fellow up to?" he muttered under his breath. The name Christopher Mudd meant little to him. He'd caught bits of stories about the man, but it was all dreary Greenlander business, pointless talk that lost his interest the second time he heard it. A year or two ago, when the Royal Fleet had anchored in Iron Man's Bay, every captain on the Isles had argued over it, some demanding the Iron Fleet strike with the opportunity to cripple the Greenlanders' fleet, others fearing it meant an invasion. But in the end, nothing had come of it, and Roderick had let the matter fade from his mind. Now, he wished he'd paid closer attention. The Kraken's kiss glided through the dark waters, the rest of their ships fanning out behind them. To the north, the distant lights of Seaguard flickered against the horizon. To the south, where they'd been told this mysterious arsenal and canal were located, only blackness. But then, just for a moment, something glinted on the water. Roderick squinted. Moonlight on the waves. Or something else? As they drew closer, Roderick pushed off the mast and wandered up to the bow, narrowing his eyes against the darkness. Then, as he finally made out the shape before them, his brow furrowed in disbelief. What the fuck is a rowboat doing out here? Others had noticed as well. Murmurs spread among the crew, and the oars halted at a sharp-barked command from Euron. The deck creaked under his uncle's boots as he strolled forward, whistling a jaunty tune. "Say, what do we have here, dear nephew?" Roderick stiffened. He hadn't even heard Euron get that close, but now he was painfully aware of the railing he was leaning over, the dark waters below. He swallowed hard to steady his voice. "It's a rowboat." Euron clicked his tongue, his amusement curdling into irritation. "Do you think I'm blind? I see the fucking boat." He inhaled deeply, composing himself before his voice dropped into something far more dangerous. "Now, what does it mean? What is it doing here?" Roderick barely had time to open his mouth before the back of his head exploded with pain. His vision blurred as Euron cuffed him hard across the neck, nearly sending him tumbling overboard. He caught himself on the rail, gasping. "You idiot. It's a forewarning. Don't you see?" Euron growled in his ear. Roderick barely had time to process the words before a lantern flared to life in the little boat below, illuminating an older man with a white beard. He sat calmly at the oars, his gaze fixed fearlessly on them as their ships drifted closer. Then, before Roderick could ask how a single rowboat could possibly be a warning, another lantern rose in the distance. A second boat, this one hugging the shoreline to their right. Then a bonfire roared to life on the land. Then another. Then another. One by one, the entire bay ignited with fire. The flames stretched in a chain all the way to Seaguard, miles away to their left. Then, from the now illuminated fortress ahead of them, a deep, mournful horn blew, long and hard, its echo rolling across the bay like distant thunder. Roderick felt something cold slither into his gut. A castle. No one told us there was a fucking castle by the arsenal. "A nice trick," Euron finally remarked, giving Roderick one last shove before turning away. Then he raised his voice. "Men. Are we afraid of a little fire?" "Never." The crew responded, their voices rising in unison after a brief pause. Yern's grin widened, a glint of madness in his eyes as he raised his arms to the sky. "Then let's show these flowery Greenlanders what true warriors look like." He paused, his smirk widening. "And let their women learn what true men feel like." The crew let out a cheer, the air thick with anticipation, as the Kraken's kiss surged forward toward the flickering lights on the horizon. Roderick's stomach tightened, the unease settling deeper as the rowboat tipped violently when the longboat collided with it. The man and his lantern plunged into the cold, dark waters, both vanishing without a trace, swallowed by the night in an instant. For the first time in a long while, Roderick muttered a quiet prayer to the drowned god, hoping the old man would find a swift and merciful end in the dark waters. Just as the words left his lips, Euron sidled up to him again, his presence like a shadow over Roderick's shoulder. The weight of his uncle's words came down heavy, close, suffocating. "Your weakness is no surprise," Euron sneered, his voice low and venomous. "Balon inherited our fathers. It's a shame he was the one to end up the oldest of our siblings." Roderick kept his face carefully blank as his uncle turned and spat into the black waters. A cold spray hit his neck, but he dared not flinch. He had learned early that challenging Euron, even in the smallest ways, never ended well. "This uprising, this Kingsmoot," Euron scoffed. "It's almost humorous that he even dares call himself king." His voice dripped with disdain. "That fool Aeron blesses him, and Victarion follows him like a lost puppy." A sharp bark of laughter cut through the night, sudden and jagged. Roderick twitched despite himself. Then, just as abruptly, Jörn's voice flattened. "I need to wet my blade." For a moment, Roderick thought those words might be meant for him. His body tensed, bracing for steel. But then, just as suddenly as he'd appeared, Euron was gone, slipping away into the shadows of the ship. Roderick stood there, rigid, waiting. Only when he was certain his uncle had truly left did he release a deep, shuddering breath. His uncle's disturbing threats? Roderick wasn't entirely sure what Euron had meant by them. Was he truly suggesting that he would make a better king than Balon? Euron was a mad bastard, no doubt, and Roderick had always felt uneasy around him, even as a boy. But the idea that he would openly move against their own family? That was true madness. Wasn't it? Roderick didn't have time to dwell on it. The shore was drawing closer, and the first hints of dawn were creeping over the horizon behind them, casting the land ahead in eerie half-light. Now that he could properly see it, the sight of their target sent a sinking feeling into his gut. The castle was a problem. Tall stone walls rose defiantly against the shoreline, enclosing a central keep that loomed over the landscape. Archers already lined the battlements, their dark silhouettes outlined against the growing light. A ladder assault would be costly, too costly. Worse still was the wall extending from the castle, sealing off land access to the arsenal below. Any force attempting to breach it would be caught in a killing field, arrows raining down from all sides. Then there were the men. On the beach, near the arsenal's boat launches, stood a formation of infantry. Not the usual half-trained levy garrisoning some backwater fort, but disciplined soldiers clad in chainmail with plate breastplates gleaming in the dawn. That was no simple castle guard. They were outnumbered, but the men on the beach stood in disciplined ranks, spears in hand, shields locked together in a tight wall of iron and oak. That formation alone was concerning. Roderick had seen Unsullied once in Tyrosh. A magister had paraded them around to impress his guests, barking orders as they shifted seamlessly from one formation to the next. These men weren't on that level, but there was something familiar in the way they held their line, the way they moved with purpose rather than panic. And that was a problem. Ironborn thrived in chaos, in wild, bloody melees where superior skill and savagery could break lesser men. But a disciplined shield wall? That was a different kind of battle entirely. The Ironborn rarely did well off their ships, at least, when not against the poorly equipped garrisons they usually raided. Roderick doubted raw aggression alone would win this day. Euron, however, seemed utterly convinced of their victory. That certainty, reckless as it was, bled into the men, steadying their doubts. Still, he readied his axe. He was no craven, drowned God be his witness, even if he wasn't the most bloodthirsty of his kin. A cup in hand or a ship underfoot was more to his liking than the senseless slaughter others relished. That had always been more Meryn's domain. But Meryn was back on Pike, left to babysit Theon and Asher under their father's orders. Roderick wasn't sure why Balon had made that choice, but at least it kept them safe. The ship lurched as it hit the shore with a dull thud. Roderick yanked his helmet down and slammed his axe against his shield, steeling himself. Doubt meant nothing now, the only way was forward. The Riverlands had never been much for putting up a fight. Even when they mustered a strong host, their lords squabbled too much to hold it together. But whoever these men were, they were different. Roderick vaulted over the railing with the second wave, boots crunching onto the stony shore. Euron was ahead, leading the charge, his laughter carrying over the din. Ironborn, Euron roared. Let us show these fuckers that what is dead may never die. The warriors surged forward, a tide of iron and fury. Roderick had half a mind to swing around the flank, but 2 arrows found their mark in the backs of the first men who tried. Archers had them covered, no easy way around. Then they crashed into the shield wall. For a moment, the sheer force of their charge shoved the line back. Roderick saw an axe hook onto a shield and rip it down, exposing the man behind it. The Ironborn roared, Except the attacker barely had time to grin before a spear was rammed through his face. A heartbeat later, a fresh soldier stepped into the gap, shield raised. Fuck. Roderick tensed, ready to throw his weight into the press, when a commanding voice rang out from within the enemy ranks. Push. The shield wall surged forward as one, shoving the Ironborn attackers back just enough to steal their momentum. Before they could regain their footing, the spears struck. Dozens of men crumpled, impaled in an instant. Roderick barely stopped himself from staggering. Who the fuck had taught them that? The Ironborn behind him roared in fury, surging forward to avenge their fallen, but the enemy formation had already sealed the gaps. The line held firm, shields locked, spears ready. Roderick glanced around, his gut churning as more Ironborn poured onto the beach, eager to join the slaughter. But it was slaughter for them, not the enemy. Then he spotted Euron. His uncle was the only one thriving in this chaos, weaving through spears and arrows like a wraith, his sword a blur of blood and steel. He laughed as he struck, never staying in one place long enough to be surrounded. Unlike the rest of them, he wasn't being funneled into the trap, he was playing with his prey. Roderick turned back to the shield wall and realized with dread that the enemy had taken a few more steps back, drawing the Ironborn further from their ships. Away from their only escape. A sudden shove from behind sent him stumbling forward. Greyjoy. Are you afraid of a little steel? Don't tell me you're a craven. Roderick had no time to respond before the press of bodies forced him into the fray. Push. The enemy drove forward again, shields slamming, spears thrusting. Roderick barely managed to brace himself in time, crouching slightly, expecting the impact. The grisly sounds of steel-piercing flesh filled the air, Ironborn impaled in the same trap again. Tire them out. They don't have many of those left now. An older Reaver bellowed, as if that was encouragement. Some fools cheered, but Roderick barely heard them. His eyes were locked on the enemy ranks. The spearmen stepped back. 3 paces. Then again. They were drawing the Ironborn in, closing the distance to whatever lay further inland. How did no one else see the noose tightening? Can you not see how? Roderick tried to shout, but the press of bodies crushed the breath from his lungs. Push. Again, he was forced forward. He was near the front now, close enough to see it all clearly, the shield wall, the gleaming spearheads, and, worse, the growing heap of Ironborn corpses littering the ground. Then, suddenly, a gap appeared in the enemy's formation. It wasn't much, just enough to lure them in. The Ironborn surged forward, desperate to exploit the weakness. Only screams came out. The moment they funneled through, the spears vanished, replaced by shorter blades. Packed in tight with nowhere to move, the first Ironborn to enter were butchered in seconds. The gap sealed again, and the formation held firm. Drowned God be good. This wasn't a battle. This was slaughter. The brutal rhythm continued, another push. Another dozen Ironborn dead. Roderick had stopped counting how many times it had happened. 5, 6, 10. Then, with a final heave, he was shoved into the front line, pressed against the enemy shields. He could see the whites of the eyes of the man directly in front of him through a narrow gap. Their eyes met. Roderick's fingers fumbled at his belt, struggling against the weight of bodies pressing in behind him. His dagger. Come on, come on. At last, he freed it. He waited. The man on the other side leaned forward, just slightly. Roderick struck. With a desperate surge, he drove the dagger between the shields. He felt resistance, then a gasp as the blade sank home. He lost grip of the dagger as the man fell from the line, the blade where his left eye should have been. The shield wall wavered. The defenders had been bracing for another push, and this sudden break had thrown them off balance. Roderick was pushed down to the ground as the Ironborn behind surged forward, trampling past him. He rolled onto his back, sucking in a breath. He had ended up behind the push now. For a fleeting moment, he thought they had finally broken through. Then the arrows fell, They rained down from the walls where the defending archers had mostly stood idle, simply watching the battle, though they had not been watching but waiting. The Ironborn had pushed ahead with no heed to their surroundings. The Ironborn were packed in tight, vulnerable. There was nowhere to run, no cover to seek. In just 2 volleys, over 50 men crumpled to the ground, screaming or silent in death. Finally, they wised up. Those who could raised their shields, forming a protective barrier on either side, but the lines stretched too thin. Their numbers had been drawn too deep inland, leaving no way to fall back in force. The beach was clogged with reinforcements unable to land, their longships now floating helplessly in the bay. Roderick heard the thud of arrows striking wood, flesh, and metal all around him. Then, through the chaos, a voice. "So, you got to wet your blade as well?" "Euron." Roderick turned his head. His uncle loomed over him, calm as ever, an amused smirk curling his lips. "You knew," Roderick realized, his voice hoarse. "You knew it was a trap." "Of course I did." Yern's smile widened. "It is a shame you were such a lousy commander, nephew. My brother will be ever so disappointed with your blunder, though you may not be in a state to have an opinion on that." Roderick's blood ran cold. "What?" Euron sighed, almost lazily. "Balon should have trusted me with command from the start. He is no true Ironborn king." Roderick pushed himself up, fury and confusion swirling in his gut. "What are you?" With startling speed, Yern's sword flicked out, the tip pressing against Roderick's throat. "What is dead may never die," Euron murmured mockingly. Then, with a final, almost dismissive thrust, just enough to nick the skin, he turned on his heel and strode away, back toward the beach. Roderick pressed a hand to his throat, breathing heavily. The cut was shallow, barely a wound, but the message was clear. Euron had no intention of staying. Roderick twisted onto his side just in time to see the last of Yern's men scrambling back to their longships. His uncle's personal fleet, his own little kingdom within the Iron Fleet, had never truly committed to the fight. Now, they were the only ships left unscathed, and they were leaving. They would sail home to Pike. They would tell Balon whatever lie Euron conjured. And Roderick Greyjoy would be left to die. Roderick staggered to his feet, every instinct screaming at him to stop this, to rally what men he could, but then a deep, mournful horn blew from beyond the wall. He turned sharply toward the sound. The gate leading into the arsenal was opening. Above, the men atop the battlements worked the gears, their movements swift and practiced. The great doors groaned as they parted, revealing what lay beyond. Roderick's breath caught in his throat. A tide of steel and gold. Hundreds of riders, their plate armor gleaming in the morning light, their golden and grey surcoats rippling as they spurred their mounts forward. He barely had time to register the shield wall breaking apart, dispersing, clearing a path. The cavalry did not wait. By river and hill, they roared collectively. Then they thundered through the gate, lances lowered, swords flashing. The Ironborn barely had time to turn, to react, before the charge slammed into them like a crashing wave. The first ranks were obliterated on impact. Horses trampled men beneath iron-shod hooves, while riders slashed and stabbed at those who remained standing. Axes and swords swung wildly, but the mounted knights were too fast, too well armored. Roderick watched in horror as his comrades fell in droves, cut down like wheat before the scythe. They had never stood a chance. Roderick barely had time to snatch up his axe and shield before a mounted knight broke from the golden tide, riding straight for him. The man's armor was finer than the others, his steel polished to a mirror sheen. His helmet, fashioned into the shape of a bird's beak, concealed his face entirely. Unlike the other knights, whose surcoats bore the golden and grey of their house, this one's was a deep brown, embroidered with a golden crown studded with emeralds. Roderick's grip tightened on his axe. He knew that blade, the dark rippling steel unmistakable. When did any of those Riverlanders get a Valyrian steel blade? Roderick braced himself as the knight's horse circled him, hooves kicking up sand and blood. Then, a voice, distorted by the helm, yet clear in its authority, rang out over the din. "I wish to know the name of the man responsible for this attack, Greyjoy, before I take his life as payment." Roderick turned to follow the circling rider, feeling foolishly small with only his axe and shield against the mounted knight. But he straightened all the same. "I am Roderick Greyjoy," he declared, "but know that it was Euron who led us here, who led us into this slaughter and then fled. Let it be known, so he cannot twist the truth." The knight tilted his head slightly, as if considering the words. Then, in a tone laced with dry amusement, he replied, "Infighting? Among the Ironborn? Surely not." Roderick gritted his teeth. "Very well," the knight continued. "I will have every town crier from here to Harrenhal announce Yern's treachery. But as for you," Roderick squared his stance, "if you think I will surrender, you're a fool." The knight gave a slow shake of his head. "I wouldn't allow it, Squid. This is a matter of principle. My vassals must see me deal with Ironborn challengers swiftly and decisively. And what better trophy than the head of the Greyjoy heir?" His horse snorted, pawing at the ground. "Prepare to meet your drowned god." Roderick's arm trembled under the force of the first blow. His shield barely held, the Valyrian steel biting deep, nearly cleaving straight through. With a grunt, he swung in retaliation, aiming for the knight's exposed arm, but his foe twisted with practiced ease. The dark blade flicked out, knocking the axe harmlessly aside. Then, to Roderick's surprise, the knight spurred his horse a few paces back before dismounting. He turned, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off stiffness. "Let us do this on equal footing, yes?" Roderick scoffed. "You can strip your armor as well, then." The knight chuckled. "Ah, so the Ironborn possess a sense of humor after all, buried beneath all the raping and reaving. How charming." Roderick scowled but held his tongue as they began to circle one another once more. "Your name, then?" he asked, his grip firm on his axe. The knight tilted his head. "I would have thought you'd already guessed. But if not..." He dipped his blade slightly in a mockery of formality. "I am Lord Paramount Christopher Mudd of the Riverlands, wielder of Torrent." Roderick's grip tightened around his axe as the weight of his ignorance pressed down on him. This was the new Mud Lord? And he wielded Valyrian steel? How much had he missed while drinking and traveling? "Those are the titles relevant to you, of course," Mudd added cheekily before darting forward, slashing sideways. Roderick barely raised his shield in time, the force rattling his arm. "One of your attendants will have to provide a full list at your funeral," he growled in return before roaring and swinging his axe in a brutal arc. The lord parried effortlessly, turning the blow aside before striking back, fast as a striking serpent. Roderick barely wrenched his shield up in time, but the Valyrian blade cut deep, shearing through the wood. With a sharp twist, Mudd wrenched the mangled shield from his grip. Roderick staggered back, now armed with only his axe. Around them, the battle was ending. His men had not won. As they circled, Roderick caught sight of the beach beyond the beached longships. The retreating sterns of Yern's ships. How had it come to this? They had been so sure, so eager, to show the Greenlanders their fury. And yet, here they were. "Not yet," Mudd finally replied. Mudd's next stroke came quick and clean, slicing straight through the wooden haft of Roderick's axe. The head of the weapon spun away, leaving him standing there, gripping a useless splintered handle. His dagger was long lost, still buried in a dead spearman's eye. Defenseless. The Valyrian steel blade arced toward his throat. Time slowed. Roderick saw it coming, though helpless to prevent it. And a part of him was unwilling, it would only drag it all out. Then, at last, he was released from his wretched existence.